All right, people. Let's start the meeting. I hope my audio is clear. As participants are pouring in, I welcome Muralidharan, who is here to give his wonderful talk based on conservation as well as his work on olive ridley turtles in Odisha. So I would like to call upon Srishti on behalf of UNA to welcome and introduce the speaker.
Good evening, everyone. I hope all of you are doing well. And we are extremely honored to have Dr. Murli with us today. And we are really excited about your talk. So, just to introduce Dr. Murli here, his work actually focuses on sea turtles and other marine flagship species, including sea snakes and sharks along the Indian coast and their interactions with fisheries. His research includes topics related to population dynamics, genetics, tropic ecology using these varied study systems. His main interests lies in sea turtle biology, marine conservation, fisheries wildlife interactions, and models of community based conservation. He is presently the field director of an NGO, Dakshin Foundation, where he carries out most of his conservation and outreach related work. He is managing editor of the Indian Ocean Turtle newsletter and also a member of the IUCN Marine Turtle Specialist Group. And well, his list of accomplishments just goes on and on. So, without any further ado, I would like to request Dr. Murli to begin with this much awaited talk. So, over to you, Dr. Murli.
Thank you so much for inviting me for this talk. And thank you for that generous introduction. One of the things that are not in my list of achievements is either registering or completing a PhD. So I'm just Muralidharan, no doctorate associated, and we can talk about that separately. We'll just go on, and I will give my talk primarily based on the work that I've been carrying out with regards to sea turtle biology and conservation in different parts of India. Yeah, is my screen visible for everybody?
Yeah.
All right. Yes, and as my title says, I'm going to talk about the different challenges and interesting things that I have come across while monitoring long-lived species such as sea turtles along the coast of India. Though my primary focus is going to be on the olive ridleys, where the chunk of my research over the last 10 years have been, I will give a short snippet on the kind of work that's also been happening on two different species that are found in India, which is the leatherback and the green turtle. So I work with Dakshin Foundation, and we also manage the Andaman and Nicobar Environment Team, which is a research station based in the Andamans. So starting the story, like I said, it is about long-term monitoring. The story begins over here where me as a young student started this program. Now I've grown both in size, weight, and hair length. But the story that I've been trying to unravel around these species still continues to hold a lot of interesting facets associated to it. So, broadly speaking, there are 7 species of sea turtles found across the world, and they can be identified based on different morphological characters according to the scales, the number of scales that you see on their carapace, that is their back, whether they have a hard shell or a leathery shell that the leatherback has, or even based on the scale patterns on their face, which is similar to how most other reptiles are taxonomically identified as well. Now, of these 7 species, 4 species are found most commonly in India. The most commonly found sea turtle species is the olive ridley. which is known to nest all across the Indian coast, and is also the smallest sea turtle species in the world. We also host a small population of the leatherback, which is the largest sea turtle species in the world, which currently nests only in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, with foraging populations of green turtles found largely in the Lakshadweep group of islands, though are also known to nest on the coast of Gujarat as well as the islands of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And the hawksbill turtle, though seen quite frequently in the reef systems across the country, it isn't known to nest in very large numbers. Now, all these different species have different types of distribution globally, with regions of high importance that are found specifically across the globe. The green turtle is one of the most widely spread species and the most commonly studied species group, whereas the olive ridley is more restricted to the tropical regions across the oceans and not found in temperate waters. The hawksbill, which is a habitat specialist, is found primarily across reef systems, and the leatherback is known to have the largest and widest distribution range of all sea turtle species, owing to its large size and uh, long migratory routes. Now, this map of India shows you uh, all the known nesting sites of sea turtle species across the country. And as you can see, there are small gaps that you find in regions which either could be due to um, the habitat type that is found over there. And mind you, this is just nesting sites across the country. As you can see, there are several sites, and most of these records are of olive ridley turtles nesting across the coast. The one thing all the seven species have in common is a very typical life history pattern, which I'm going to start with the nesting, where female turtles come onto beaches where they nest, lay their eggs, and head back into the ocean. The hatchlings then emerge out of their nests after incubating under the sand and independently go out into the waters. Following which, the developmental stage into adults is what is also commonly known as the lost years for most sea turtle species, where we really aren't sure like which parts of the world that they're doing. So no physical tracking of animals have been done, but using several advanced techniques such as particle tracking and also looking at current patterns, we do have a rough idea of where these hatchlings travel to. Since they're really small in number and sea turtles lay several hundred eggs per reproductive cycle, they also have a very high mortality, so which makes it challenging to study this phase. Once they become adults, the adults are known to have long distance migrations between their foraging areas and their breeding grounds. And once they reach their breeding grounds, they reproduce in the offshore waters, and following which nesting takes place. Now, moving on to the one of the primary characters, very popularly known in the state of Odisha as well, is the olive ridley turtle. It's the smallest amongst the sea turtle species, with a close cousin in the Kemp's ridley. Uh, uh, it can grow up to around 60 to 80 centimeters. That is the size of its shell, weighs about 35 to 45 kilos, and has a diet that is very omnivorous, primarily feeding on shrimps, crustaceans, and occasionally jellyfish. And it is an open ocean dwelling species, meaning that only during the reproductive cycle do they come close to the shore. Otherwise, their foraging is out at deep sea, where they feed on uh, these different things. The olive ridley nests 1 to 2 times per season and lays between 100 to 150, sometimes more, eggs per clutch. It takes on average 45 to 50 days for the clutch to incubate and emerge. And normally they have a nesting interval of 1 to 2 years, which means after every nesting cycle, a female turtle may take up to 2 years before it comes back to nest. Now, olive ridleys, as I said, have a primarily tropical distribution with large nesting populations found around Central and South America, primarily in Costa Rica and Mexico, and large Aribada populations, which is the mass nesting populations found only in South and Central America at these sites, and two large nesting sites on the coast of Odisha in India, and one minor nesting site in the Andaman Islands. Now, this is the phenomenon which the olive ridley is most famous for, and as commonly seen in several uh, plants and animals, they have a synchronous reproductive cycle where several thousand, hundreds of thousands of female turtles synchronously arrive onto shore to nest. Now, the olive ridley has two distinct types of nesting. One is the mass nesting, where they come in these several thousands, which are restricted to a few beaches across the world, but they're also known to nest solitarily along different parts of the coast. So my work has primarily been focused on the mass nesting population, or the Aribada, which happens in the coast of Odisha at the Rushikulya nesting beach, which is in the southernmost district in Ganjam. A typical scene during a mass nesting is a beach that is completely filled with turtles, each female trying to lay its nest and very often digging up past nests as well. Now, we've been studying these turtle populations at different sites using uh, a combination of factors. Now, by we, I mean the group of researchers that are working across different institutions. One of the simplest forms of research that we undertake is studying individual identity using these external tags, where these tags are clipped onto the flippers of the turtles, which has a specific number associated with it, which can be easily read out by anybody. We also use something called passive internal transponder tags, or PIT tags, which are very similar to your barcode scanners, which are surgically implanted. We're using a syringe. Now, these PIT tags are as small as a rice grain, so they really don't make much of a difference. But they are a lot more easier to administer, but require specific equipment to read out the number associated with the animal. So most common, as we carry out, most commonly we do a combination of both the flipper tags and the PIT tags, so that we ensure that information with regards to the animal is collected. Other biometric information associated with the size of the animal, the eggs, and the weight is also collected during the process. We've also been monitoring the temperature of nests using these data loggers that you can see, which automatically monitors temperatures in the nests during the incubation phase. Now, why this is important is that we are very well aware that temperature plays a very important role in the development and physiology of most reptiles, but specifically so in sea turtles, they're also associated with a phenomenon known as temperature-dependent sex determination, which in simple terms can be said that the gender of the hatchling is dependent upon the temperature at which it was incubated at. And this specific switch happens during a thermosensitive period during the incubation, usually the middle third, that is around the third week after the laying of the eggs. Now, we've been monitoring temperatures of these nests in Orissa to understand whether there exists any specific skew in sex ratios due to warming temperatures, and whether there is a need for mitigation that has to be taken place. So sea turtle temperatures, sea turtle eggs are sensitive to temperature in a way that warmer temperatures cause the turtle hatchlings to develop into females, where that is warmer above, in olive ridleys, about 28 to 29 degrees Celsius, whereas cooler temperatures make the hatchlings develop into males. We've also been monitoring the movement of these animals to understand the difference between their foraging areas and their nesting sites through telemetry programs such as satellite telemetry. This has primarily been focused in leatherbacks in the Andamans, though other agencies have conducted work on olive ridleys in Odisha. We have also been trying to understand the spatial distribution of these aggregations of turtles in the offshore waters. As I'd mentioned, these turtle species um, come to nearshore waters to breed, and Orissa has a large aggregation uh, in front of the mass nesting beaches at Gahirmata and Rishikulya. And understanding the patterns of their aggregations also help us uh, evaluate the conditions that the turtles are using to, one, start nesting, and also to understand management regimes, since they're also shared spaces with fishers in the area who use the same waters for fishing. Now, to understand the spatial distribution, we conduct a series of transects, which basically are we take the boat out into the nearshore waters following a specific route and observe the number of turtles that we see in this specific region all across the coast of Orissa. And we try to understand what type of aggregation patterns are there. Now, over the last 10 years, we have seen that in Rishikulya, that over the months, the aggregation type changes. The density of the aggregation also is different based on the number of turtles that nest in that year. Though the densities that arrive to the offshore waters is actually quite comparable to the nesting numbers. Now, early in the season, that is in December, as you can see in the top row, you see a more sparse and dispersed form of aggregation, which starts becoming more concentrated just prior to the mass nesting in front of the mass in the nesting beach. Now, these turtles in Orissa um, are known to forage all across the Bay of Bengal, but our satellite telemetry studies have indicated that most turtles that nest on the coast of Odisha travel all the way towards the offshore waters of Sri Lanka, with some sticking around the mainland coast of India and even a few going towards Southeast Asia. Uh, One of the key questions that we people do ask is, why do turtles nest only in specific beaches? Why does mass nesting happen only in specific areas, and what is special about these sites? To understand this, we've also been monitoring the dynamics of the nesting beach. Uh, Unlike most terrestrial systems, coastal spaces are extremely dynamic and fluctuate frequently based on tidal patterns, outflow from rivers, flooding. And this animation shows you how the nesting beach at Rishikulya hasn't been specifically restricted to one particular area, and turtles have nested across different sections of the beach, and the beach itself changes shape every year based on the weather patterns in the previous year. Interestingly, one of the questions that's also asked is, aggregating in larger numbers also has an effect of reducing success in hatching, that is individual nesting success. But our work has actually shown that the nesting site at Rishikulya has an extremely high hatching success percentage, where on average, more than 80% of all the eggs laid in a particular clutch emerge successfully. And this is specifically interesting because in comparison to the sites that you would see in Costa Rica, in Mexico, and other parts where mass nesting happen, including Gahirmata in northern Odisha, where the hatching success can be as low as 10 to 20%, sometimes even lower. Rishikulya has maintained a fairly larger hatching success. And this could have to do with the kind of dynamics that the beach itself sees. So basically what happens at the end of a season is the nutrient load that is formed in the beach due to the eggs themselves get washed away due to flooding, and this helps in the uh, this helps specifically in the cleaning of the sands, and could potentially help in the nesting success as well. Uh, and the temperature monitoring study that we've been doing uh, has shown us very interesting trends, with certain years having on average higher nest temperatures going up to 31.5, which would mean a higher proportion of females being produced. But these patterns have been fluctuating since the time we've started our monitoring in 2009. And this is seen in the sex ratios that we've observed as well. So for looking at the sex ratios of hatchlings, we physically need to verify the development of gonads, and this cannot be done using genetic markers, because as mentioned, the sex of the sea turtles is determined by the temperature, and hence they don't have sex chromosomes as well. So we collect dead hatchlings and look at the histological patterns of their gonads to see whether they're male or females. And these have shown us very similar results, where we've had fluctuating patterns of male to female sex ratios, uh, though predominantly most years still are producing female hatchlings. And with a looming concern of climate change and warming weathers, this could potentially be something of larger concern in the years to come. Now, the leatherback monitoring camp in the Andaman Islands has been primarily restricted to monitoring the nesting numbers. There are much less dense aggregations of leatherback turtles that you see in the Andamans. On average, we get between 1,000 to 2,000 nests across the entire island group. Though we get so many nests, an adult female leatherback can nest between 8 to 12 times in a season, in comparison to the olive ridley, which nests probably once or twice within a nesting season. Um, this means that even though there are a large number of nests, the number of females that contribute to that nesting numbers are much fewer. And interestingly, the leatherbacks also take much longer duration between nesting intervals. Uh, Leatherbacks can take between 4 to 6 years to nest again once a nesting cycle is complete. And this is primarily dependent on the diet pattern of the species as well. The olive ridley, being largely omnivorous, consumes a lot of calcium rich content in their diet, hence making it easier for the formation of the eggshells. But the leatherback is a diet specialist, feeding primarily on jellyfishes, and hence needs a longer duration to accumulate enough calcium in their system to form the egg structures. But even though they nest in much smaller numbers, the leatherbacks that nest in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are extremely far ranging, and they have the ones that we have tracked nesting in the Andaman group of islands travel as far away as the coast of Madagascar and Mozambique uh, on the west, and on the east all the way till the coast of Australia. And we don't know if they're traveling further, because in these cases, sometimes the transmitters have died out. And hence, management of a population that nests in a particular region is an incomplete story when you have a species that lives long. On average, sea turtles live between 60 to 80, sometimes maybe longer, but they do traverse across such a uh, wide habitat types and through different regions. Uh, Did somebody raise their hand?
Sorry, I did it by mistake.
Oh, okay, cool. So the leatherbacks, on the other hand, travel to such far and wide distances that managing only the nesting population in one region gives an incomplete story of what's happening uh, to the population at a global scale. Next, we move on to another interesting case of the green turtles in Lakshadweep. Now, the green turtles are primarily named because of not the color of the animal themselves, but because it was once a very commonly used species for consumption, as well as the consumption in meat. So, when you hear stories of turtle soup, the green turtle was the species that was primarily used. But also, the fat of the animal has been used by communities in many parts of the globe, traditionally for waterproofing the insides of their boat. And the color of the fat is green in color. And this is why the turtle got a name green turtle, and not because of the external coloration. Green turtles are mostly brownish in color, but they're also dietary specialists, primarily foraging on seagrass, seaweeds, and are primarily herbivorous once they become adults. But during the juvenile and growth phases, they are omnivorous. Now, the green turtle is also a large-bodied herbivore, which needs to consume a large amount of forage to re- to to acquire its dietary needs. Now, the island systems around Lakshadweep are typically like this, with a very small strip of land, which is surrounded by a coral atoll, in between which there is a reasonably stable lagoon. And these lagoons are ideal habitats for seagrass systems to come up. Now, in the last 2 decades, both the local communities as well as the researchers working in the region identified two things. One, there was a decline in seagrass meadows and cover all across the islands, which was causing secondary effects on other species which were dependent on seagrass for forage as well as cover, but also a phenomenal increase in the number of green turtles in the region. And that had led to a form of conflict where the green sea turtle had grown in numbers so widely across the different island systems in Lakshadweep that they had begun to decimate the seagrass cover in that region. This has an impact both on the local habitat, but also in the long run would have an impact on the sea turtle species themselves, because when the forage quantity reduces, the quality of dietary content that they get inside would also reduce. And even though we still primarily found seagrass in their diet, we were also finding evidences of them foraging on other matter, and we don't know what the impacts in the long term is going to be about both the seagrass meadows if the population continues to increase. Now, this increase in population was accounted for by two things. One, the people mentioned that with the incoming of the Wildlife Protection Act and legal protection for the green turtle species, the capture and consumption or usage of green turtles had reduced, and hence the populations had exploded. But apart from just the Lakshadweep Islands, as we had seen in the case of the leatherbacks, green turtles are also known to travel far and wide. So even though they're foraging in and around the Lakshadweep Islands, they could be nesting at other sites. The closest large nesting grounds for green turtles was the island of Sri Lanka, where there have been conservation programs which have been managing and releasing hatchlings by keeping them in hatcheries or growing them to a certain size, which has gained popularity and interest over the last 2 and 3 decades. So, by supplementing populations through conservation activities and the decline of hunting, the turtle numbers has exploded. But the other concern that was brought up was the decline in large predatory species, which would have ideally fed on these sea turtle species, such as large sharks, and the growth of the shark fishing industry in the Indian Ocean area and the decline of large predators had caused a boom in these populations. So these three turtle species at these three different sites tell different stories, where you have an immediate picture that you see of turtle numbers, but we have associated biological factors that are associated with the kind of behavior that they're exhibiting or the effects on the population and what they do to the habitat. So, yeah, and this is primarily what, again, a question that I'm very commonly asked is like, what is the importance of sea turtles or the role of sea turtles in maintaining habitats or why it is important for their conservation. So these three different examples tell us how species can play an important role in different ecosystems by either maintaining the habitats or facilitating nutrient cycling as well. Now, that was most of my ecological research part, where I touched primarily about the data collection and the monitoring of specific characters. But this communication to effectively reach out to conservation or a general audience, we have been using several platforms ranging from websites, social media, blogs, posters, and specific manuals, as well as technical newsletters. And all of this information is accessible and available for free online for anybody who's interested in learning more about sea turtles. And hopefully, we will be developing several more content on the other species groups that I work on. Very recently, we have also come up with an online exhibition, which is called aribada.in, which basically tells different stories of sea turtles and their associations with both cultures and interactions with human communities across the Indian subcontinent and global. And you can also add in collections of sea turtle stories or artifacts that you have with you onto this website. So this is relatively new, which we started up in the last year. So I welcome you all to visit this and share your comments with regards to this. And none of this work that we've been carrying out would have been possible without our close association with coastal communities and the knowledge that we've derived from their traditional understanding of these systems and association with important quote unquote important animals for conservation. Primarily in Orissa, where the mainland coast, for example, Orissa, there is a large population of traditional fishers that are dependent on the same coastal waters, which are which are sometimes designated as important only for the conservation of charismatic animals such as sea turtles. But for effective conservation to happen and I would say socially just conservation practice to happen, it can only be undertaken along with the cooperation and coordination with these local fishers. All our management activities at the different sites are very closely done in association with our staff who are local community members who have been collecting most of the information that we have used to understand either sex ratios or population dynamics in different regions, but also working very closely with uh, them in management practices such as rescue and release of hatchlings, conducting education programs in association with local conservation groups such as grassroots NGOs. And again, even though I am summarizing the work, uh, my role in this had started in as one of the data collectors on field, but over the last 10 years, it is only due to a large number of individuals who have contributed both in terms of data collection, compilation of reports, or producing material that is accessible to everybody. And many of these individuals are now working in different regions across the country. And yes, we also partner with uh, conservation groups and grassroots NGOs that work across the coast uh, under the aegis of a body known as the Turtle Action Group, which is a network of partners who work almost in every state uh, across the country. And we use this network to share information about both conservation challenges as well as developing the skills of different bodies in improving the kind of uh, interventions that they can undertake at these different regions. And that's it for now. Thank you. And I can open up to questions. It would be easy if one person can read out the question.
Yes,
and
yes, sure, sir, sure.
Yeah.
So there is a question from Abhinash. How does they reproduce? Is there any specific conditions or environment needed?
I don't understand what you mean by how do they reproduce.
I guess he's asking about the specific conditions that's required for healthy reproduction.
So there is specific breeding cycles that do happen for each of the turtle species. Like olive ridley's nest in a particular season. For example, let's say the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, where all 4 species of sea turtles nest. There are different nesting seasons for each of the different species. The olive ridley and leatherback nesting season coordinate around the same time between December to mid-Feb, whereas the green turtles nest much later in the season, and so do the hawksbill. So different species have different specific conditions under which they can reproduce successfully. And this is specific from region to region as well.
And then we have a question from Abhishek. What factors determine whether olive ridley will nest in vast numbers or solitary?
That's an interesting question. So, like I had mentioned, now there are 2 large nesting sites in Odisha where the mass nesting does take place, but they do nest in several hundreds and thousands solitarily all across the different beaches in Orissa as well as different parts of the East Coast. There is a small aggregation site or an Aribada site that is in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which we believe is something that has come up very recently. Now, Orissa also hosted another nesting site at the Devi River mouth, which hasn't seen mass nesting since the early to mid 90s. It is also possible that these turtles may move between different sites to nest. We do have evidence that the same turtles nesting at Rushikulya also nest at Gahirmata during mass nesting events. So the theory is that once aggregations of turtles that nest at a particular beach reach some sort of critical minimum, that would induce a sort of collective behavior that would make the turtles nest synchronously. So that is the specific thing about the Aribada, the synchronous nesting. You might get 100 nests a night, but that isn't an Aribada. An Aribada is specific to the Ridleys where uh, the behavioral patterns of them nesting takes place in a very synchronous manner. For all other turtle species, you also do see a very gradual increase with a peak in nesting numbers that you would see across a season. But the Aribada is something that you see one single peak and an immediate die off of those nesting numbers. So we don't know. There could be new Aribada sites that do form in different parts of the coast. This has been observed in other mass nesting populations in Costa Rica and Mexico, where Aribada beaches or mass nestings beaches have died out. Again, quote unquote, died out, and new beaches have been discovered. So it is very likely that they could be moving across. Again, long-lived species. What's happening today could potentially change in 30 years.
Okay, so we have another question from Abhishek.
Yeah.
What are the limitations of satellite tracking? Can any large enough animal be tracked?
The primary limitation of satellite tracking, I think, logistically is costs. Again, a single transmitter for turtles will cost you anywhere between a lakh to 2 lakhs. And information that you derive from it, if a turtle transmits data for over a year, can cost about another lakh or so. Since it's not what we call an active tracking system, we're not following the animal, we're dependent on the device to be working in perfect conditions. So we don't know the reasons of failure. We've had instances of animals which have been attached with transmitters which didn't transmit even a single data point and died out afterwards. But we also had instances of animals transmitting data for more than a year. So yeah, so the limitations are that, but the limitations are also advantages because active tracking means you literally need to travel and follow the animal. This you can sit at the luxury of your home or your office and watch a turtle move from Andamans to the coast of Africa.
Okay, sir. So we have another question from Avrajit.
Mhm.
How long do the transmitters last, and how long do leatherbacks take to travel to Africa and Australia?
Yeah. So the transmitter battery life can last, like I said, even up to 500 days. Now, this is dependent on the research question that you'd like to ask. If I'm more interested in understanding the daily activity patterns of an animal, I would require that the transmitter sends out signals at a much more faster frequency than if the objective of my study is to see what they do over a long period of time, which means I'm trying to conserve the battery of the transmitter unit itself. So you can program each device to send out signals of its location. So it's very similar uh, to you using your location settings on your mobile phone, right? If you keep it turned on the entire day, the battery life is going to last much lesser than what it would if you only turn it on when you want to find its location. Um, now, time taken to travel to the different sites. Now, there are two different phases at which they travel. One is when they're actively migrating, uh, where they can move really long distances rather quickly, and times where they're passively migrating or they're potentially foraging in those grounds along the way. So they took anywhere around 200 days to travel across from the Andamans to the coast of Africa and the coast of Australia.
I have one question on tracking. Can I ask it?
Yes, go ahead, Abhishek.
Yeah. Can any large enough animal be tracked? Are there any specific requirements in their morphological features?
Any large enough and small enough animal can be tracked. There have been people who have been tracking even movements of frogs and birds as well. And the largest living animal is the blue whale. And definitely you can use trackers to study their movement as well. So there is the limitation is primarily in the device. So we do design these devices to be small enough and light enough so that they don't cause a hindrance to the animal that is carrying it. That is our primary concern. But the smaller you make it, you're reducing the power of the components as well as the size of your battery, and you're giving up on efficiency over there. There is a lot of tags that are being developed which could harness solar power to recharge batteries, and there are different types of transmitters. I have given you the example of satellite transmitters, but there are transmitter units which use the radio frequencies which require much lesser battery. There are transmitter units which emit acoustic pings which can be received by units very similar to radar, again, which use much lesser battery than satellite transmitters.
Is your question answered, Abhishek?
Yes, thank you.
We have another question from Pranay. Does a
Mhm.
species of turtle, being specialist in its food choice, carry extra weight from a conservation point of view?
See, I don't think the biology of a species should be associated with its conservation importance. Again, like I'd focus my talks on looking at several of the biological aspects and the data that we're collecting for monitoring these populations. Assigning conservation importance to them directly has a lot of difficult challenges in its way. One of the things that I briefly mentioned is when they share spaces with human communities, where do you give importance, especially when the associated human communities are also impoverished due to several other developmental needs. Being a specialist in diet or habitat gives us an idea of specific needs that can be identified, but that shouldn't be the primary driver of a conservation model, is what I believe.
Okay, so we have another question from Pranay. What is the size, weight, or age of the turtle that are taken into consideration when injecting the PIT tags? What is the lower limit in size, weight, or age when injecting the tags?
The pit tags are really small. Yeah, the same pit tags can be injected even into the body of a frog. It's literally the size of a rice grain and weighs almost nothing. So pit tags actually are very useful tools to mark individuals in comparison to the flipper tags, um, because they're less cumbersome. But on the other end, it requires specialized equipment to identify them. So in terms of in pit tags, we don't take the size, weight, or age of the animal into consideration. But for the external tags, which again, there is a weight associated with it, it could increase the chances of drag while swimming or susceptibility to get caught in fishing nets and entanglement. There are different sizes that are made for different species, as well as sizes between juveniles and adults. And anyway, most of the tagging that all the tagging that we do are on adult breeding females. So they're already old enough to manage these conditions.
Okay, so we have a question from Manali.
Yes.
Compared to the date of nest temperature and sex of offsprings for Olive Ridley for the other years, the data of 2011 and 14 seemed slightly off. As in, even though the average nest temperature was low in 2011, the proportion of females was significantly higher, and the complete opposite was seen for 2014. What could be the possible reasons for this?
So there are different things that could have occurred. One is nesting could have taken place earlier in the season or later in the season. For example, if the mass nesting event, which is the largest contributor of hatchlings to the population, takes place in the month of March, then the possibility of the eggs incubating at higher temperatures is definitely higher, because the summer begins to start by April and temperatures around Odisha increases. If mass nesting takes place in early February, then your temperatures are going to increase much more gradually. This, on the other hand, again, all of you need to understand that climate change isn't about linear increases in temperatures. We're not talking about temperatures that are going to constantly increase in a linear fashion. It specifically means erratic climate conditions. So there could be unseasonal rainfall that happens post nesting during the incubation phase, which reduces the temperatures than a normal climatic, what one would call a regular climatic event. So this can also cause a change in nest temperatures and sex ratios. And all of you are aware that there are global warming events that happen on a regular basis. That is your El Nino and La Nina events, where there are certain years where you do see spurts of heat waves or differences in ocean currents as well. So there are several other factors that you need to look into. If you only focus on the temperatures that are being recorded, then you kind of tend to lose sight of the larger picture that is happening across scale.
Okay, so we have another question from Pranay. The boom in numbers which you speak of due to reduction in number of direct predators, is it speculated or are numbers projected to ascertain this to cause an eventual crash in near or far future?
It cannot be ascertained. We know for a fact that shark numbers have declined globally across the tropics. And this is primarily looking at catch records. Large-bodied predators in ocean systems have seen a very huge decline across most coastal and marine systems. So this is a classic example of prey predator relationship and regulation of populations. Though it is a lot more difficult to ascertain risks associated with predator presence, this is mostly speculative as well. And a lot of this information doesn't necessarily have to come only from ecological sources. A lot of this information is things that have come from traditional community knowledge themselves. If somebody was just, for example, if somebody was just looking at changes in fish catch that are coming in Lakshadweep, that is from reef fish, they would have noticed a decline in particular species, let's say species X. And they could have said, oh, species X is declining, but what is the cause of the decline? The cause of the decline could be that species X is very closely associated with seagrass meadow habitats for the spawning events that take place. And with the loss of cover and increased predation of the fingerlings of that species X, the populations of that fish has declined. So the decline of the seagrass has happened because of over increased grazing that has happened by sea turtles, which have increased in number due to multiple reasons potentially. The lack of predators, increased conservation practices that are happening globally, and also the decline of consumption that could have potentially been managing certain populations. So, yeah, I think that's the way that I would look at these systems.
Okay. So we have another question from Abhishek. Do all turtle species have similar behavior like the olive ridley dance?
That's an interesting question. No, the ridley turtles, both the olive ridley and the Kemp's ridley are the only species which do what is very popularly known as the ridley dance, where after depositing the eggs and loosely covering the nest by sand, they lift their body using their four flippers and pat down the nest with their body. This could be associated with primarily because of the small size of the species in comparison to the other species. Since they are smaller, the size of their flippers are also smaller. Hence, the depth of the nest is also much shallower, making them more susceptible to terrestrial predation events. So, it could be an evolved behavior that ensures better protection for the nest. So yeah, we don't see something similar in other species.
Okay. We have another question from Nilesh.
Yeah.
Do the ridleys return back to same place for nesting? Do the offsprings come back to their birthplace?
This is again one of my favorite questions as well. The general stories that do follow around sea turtles is that sea turtles come back to the same beaches that they were born. This is largely untrue. Now, I had given an example of the same turtle nesting at both Gahirmata and Rishukulia in Orissa. They're about 300 kilometers apart. Now, this doesn't explain whether the turtle was born in Gahirmata or Rishukulia. What I would rather say is that all, and this is true for all sea turtle species. We've had records of a leatherback turtle that nested in Little Andaman, that nesting in the Great Nicobar Islands, which is again about 400 to 500 kilometers away. So broadly, post their foraging phase, once they are traveling to their breeding sites, they arrive at a larger region. Let's say for olive ridleys, it would be the coast of Odisha. And they could nest anywhere along the coast of Orissa, and the path of their migration is dependent on several factors, which include offshore currents, and the hatchlings will also be following those similar patterns. Now, how do we know that the group of animals that are nesting in a region are specific to that region? That is what we found out through genetics, that turtles nesting in Orissa and the East Coast are very specific to that region because they carry specific haplotypes in comparison to turtles nesting in different parts of India or different parts of Southeast Asia. So, which is why we know that, and this is similar for most nesting populations across the coast. So we know that there are population groups in different regions, but they're not specific to the nesting beaches.
Okay, so we have another question from Adesh.
Mhm.
Based on the predictions of the weather, is it possible to predict the patterns of nesting under the data accumulated so far, or weather predictions used for nesting predictions?
For one, we are using like globally accepted climate models to understand what could potentially be the effects of increasing temperatures on sex ratios if they continue to nest during the specific times of the year. And this could be on average a 1 degree rise or a 2 degree rise, or a linear increase in temperature as such. But we really can't predict what is going to happen. Again, climate science is also not extremely accurate in terms of their forecasting. It can only give us potential scenarios that we could face. Yeah, so we do conduct some work which is looking at these impacts.
Okay, so we have another question from Avrajal. Is the mass migration affected due to sea traffic? Like, do they constantly change their routes?
So we don't know. This is another question that we don't know whether these turtles migrates. The olive ridley specifically migrate again in large aggregations. We only know that they arrive and aggregate at particular places in the offshore waters in large numbers. Now, this could be affected potentially by vessel traffic. A lot of the routes that are used or currents that are used are again commonly used by for maritime travel or shipment of cargo, etc. And there is a growing body of literature which has been looking at global shipping routes and animal movement routes to look at potential effects of conflict due to coincidence of occurrence. Now, we don't know whether they will be potentially able to change their migratory routes. Like, again, these are studies that happen one-off and requires constant monitoring to see whether there is any difference in types of patterns in migration that occurs between years. But I would imagine that, again, they're not just long-lived for an individual's lifetime. They are an extant species of a group of reptiles which have been around for several million years and evolved through much more difficult climatic events. So yeah, we don't know uh, what could happen in the future. Again, those are different time scales that we're looking at.
We have another question from Abhishek.
Mhm.
During mass nesting, do the turtles ensure they don't nest in a spot previous turtle has laid eggs at? If yes, how?
No, they don't ensure. This is one of the common things that happen, that turtles dig up old nests. Now, there are several theories which talk about what are the advantages of nesting in aggregations. The most popularly uh, used theory and accepted form is what is known as predator satiation. When nesting solitarily, turtles have a larger risk of predation of nests by terrestrial predators, which affects the survival of their offspring. But a collective aggregation reduces the overall percentage of predation risk. While individual nests might get predated upon, this works on the principle of collective fitness. Like, by making sure that they nest together, they potentially are reducing fitness on individuals by uh, overcrowding and the potential of an individual's nest getting damaged in the process. But collectively, as a population group, they do have an advantage of reducing the risk of predation. Now, interestingly, in Costa Rica, there is uh, consumption of sea turtle eggs is common in Costa Rica. Actually, was quite common all across coastal communities globally and India. In Costa Rica, they have a very specific egg collection system that happens during the mass nesting. Now, mass nesting is an event that happens over several days. So there is a licensed egg collection system that allows people to go and collect as many nests or eggs as they can during the first day of mass nesting. Since the nests laid on the first day of mass nesting stand a much larger chance of risk of excavation by turtles that nest on the following days, um, there is a licensed form of a collection system which ensures that there is a legal form of harvest that takes place, so that it can potentially reduce the poaching incidents that people go and poach other nests. Whereas it's also taking all the eggs which could have potentially been destroyed by the nesting events that take place in the next few days. And this has successfully been going on for several decades, without any serious effect on population numbers. It is very controversial globally. Many people agree, or disagree with that concept. But theoretically, it should work, and it seems to be working practically as well.
Okay, so we don't
Overlap.
have.
May I ask the question?
Mhm.
Yeah. So when these nests overlap, is there a chance that the new turtle, while digging, might damage the already existing nests?
Definitely.
I mean, eggs or yeah.
They can dig up the nest entirely and damage the entire nest and relay eggs in the same egg cavity.
Okay, so I don't see any more questions here. Participants can also unmute and ask the questions if they're interested.
Aniruddha has raised his hand.
Hi, Mural.
Hey, Roy, what's up?
Nice talk. Very nice talk. And also thanks to Una for conducting this. Before I have a few questions, quick questions, hopefully. But before that, I just want to ask you this. Do you have internship opportunities?
Yes, we do have internship opportunities, both lab-based as well as potentially field-based. We haven't done much in the last 2 years, which I guess probably is the case everywhere. So yeah, all these projects have different internship opportunities as well.
Okay. Yeah. Regarding the TSD, so I was just wondering whether you've seen in any particular year there's been like a skewed operational sex ratio. And the reason why I asked this is when you showed your density maps over how many ever years, I think it was over 10 years that you've done. And there seemed to be some sort of, it started with low density, then became high, and then became low. I mean, the last one was sort of towards the lower side.
Yeah.
I'm wondering whether it's got anything to do with general cyclicity and temperatures as well.
Yeah. So we don't have information really on operational sex ratios. Again, the primary flaw with many of these systems is that we are trying to believe that it is, the ideal situation would be a 50-50 sex ratio, which really is not the case in many reptiles, especially and sea turtles specifically, that we do know that the normal operational sex ratios will already be skewed towards females, primarily because it does help in maintaining populations on the long run, because a few males are enough over the years to maintain population sizes. The hatchling sex ratios give us an idea of what potentially operational sex ratios for the populations could be, because these are what we're looking at a recruitment phase. So yeah, I think, like I said, there are different events that happen in multiple years. Because we've been monitoring the offshore aggregations as well as nesting numbers every year, and there are certain years where mass nesting events didn't take place as well, but still had large aggregation patterns offshore, which gives us an idea of the overall pool of turtles that are there, of which a certain proportion might be nesting every year. One particular graph that I missed out is the intensity of mass nesting itself in this talk, because I'm actually cleaning up the data set as well. We have certain years where we have mass nesting events where only about 14 to 20,000 turtles nested, but we've also had events where 2 lakh turtles nested. And both these are normal events. 20,000 isn't a decline, and 2 lakhs isn't an increase in population. These are normal events which have fluctuating numbers. This could be associated with offshore current patterns associated with larger El Nino events. It could also have to do with the synchronization of reproductive cycles. Like I said, olive ridleys don't need to nest every year. So on years where more turtles coincide their reproductive cycles to nest, you would see larger nesting events. And as more cycles, when it hits the lower this thing, you might have a much smaller nesting event. I hope that answered all parts of it.
Yeah, it did. Yeah. 2 lakhs, that's ridiculous. Hey, so the other thing that was really interesting is the success rate, the hatchling success rate between Gahirmatha and Costa Rica. So you said the Gahirmatha one the hatchling success rate was more than Costa Rica.
Rushikulya is the
Rushikulya. Okay.
Yeah.
But why is that? Is there more predator pressure in Costa Rica?
It has to do with the type of nesting phenology that Costa Rica has mass nesting events almost every month. So in India or in Orissa, we record 1 or 2 mass nesting events in a year, which is restricted to just prior to early summer. In past historical records, we knew that it was closer to late winter, that is December, January. But in the past 2 decades, it's been somewhere between February and March. And it's just one singular event that happens. Costa Rica records up to 11 mass nestings in a year, so almost 1 every month. So there is a very high load of microbial content and decaying content in the nesting beach itself. Now, which is where I show that shifting habitat patterns. Because it happens only once or twice a season and post a heavy monsoon and flooding events that take place, it's almost as if the beaches get washed away and reformed before nesting events. And this is more stark in Rushikulya than at Gahirmatha, where Gahirmatha is a much smaller stretch of beach and it is an island system. There's also the impact of inundation that happens from both the sea and the river.
Okay. Yeah. One last quick question. Yeah. You are an ecologist and a conservation biologist.
Yeah.
These are completely different things, at least as I understand. It's interesting that you mentioned this whole issue with the green turtles, the population boom. So where are you here, as an ecologist or a conservation biologist, or as a conservationist? I mean, would you recommend culling of population for so that the population is maintained, or so what is your going to be what is your recommendation going to be?
See, the term conservation biologist itself is very contested, because it means that
Thank you for saying that.
It means that you're technically trying to say that you're using some sort of ecological sense to inform your conservation decision. Now, that conservation decision to manage certain populations might require something like culling, which I can also justify as an ecologist. I can completely justify, because I would, in that sense, make myself as the predatory species in that ecological network. But also, and again, this is conservation is a highly debatable field of study where it's primarily based on individual emotions. There are people who would say that you can't kill any animals for any purpose, even if it means that it is leading to its own decline or is causing more harm to itself. Versus somebody who is willing to take a little bit more off the beat solution or difficult decisions to ensure that the health of the ecosystem is maintained for everybody. Again, the impacts of increased, like we cannot disassociate the habitats that conservation important species are occupying with human communities that are also dependent on those same regions. This is where, like, again, it's extremely conflicting, because I don't separate human systems from ecological systems as an ecologist as well, but it is one of the primary drivers of my conservation, my personal conservation theory, as well as how I could make a difference happen. So the interactions that do take place both in ecosystems as well as human communities that are closely associated with that need to come together to arrive at better decision making. So yeah, it's difficult, like in many cases. Like you just said, 2 lakh turtles nest in Orissa at one nesting event. I don't know who in their right minds would still call them an endangered species. And this is just in Orissa.
Okay, yeah. All right, I'm done. Thanks, Murli.
Yeah, I think we're done with our time as well. I thank you guys again. And if you have any further questions, I have shared my email ID with the Nature Club. So please write directly to me and I will try to get back to you as soon as possible.
Yeah, sure, Murli. I was just going to ask to share your email ID. So we'll share the recording with you as well as the people who might have missed the opportunity to attend the meeting. And I will also mail them your email ID so that since there are still questions pouring in, they can maybe mail you and ask you.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you for the excellent talk, Murli.
Yes. Thank you so much, guys. All the best.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.